Okay, once again, folks, I'll have you take your Bibles and turn to Joshua, chapter 23. This is lesson 10 in our History of Israel study. We are at about the halfway mark. I think in that first lesson I indicated to you, I had to start my clock here. Instead of operating with my watch here now, which ends up being covered up with my sleeve, I don't think about it very much. I have a little clock on here. It's actually a stopwatch. And I can keep a little more accurate time here if I can start it on properly. And I think I indicated to you in the first lesson or the first couple of lessons that this study should run the range of about 16 lessons, 18 lessons, something along those lines. It may very well still be that, although don't be surprised if we may need one or two more. 20, I think, would probably be the maximum, although I will try and not go that far. But we are about at the halfway point now here. And the foundational things we've covered are the most important things of all. If the foundation is solid and strong and everything, you can handle on your own things that are coming and the history of Israel, even though we just look at major highlight type issues and survey it very briefly. And with that solid foundation laid, it provides for you the capacity to do that. And therefore the emphasis has been upon that foundation. It's been upon appreciating the 5 courses of punishment, appreciating God's Jehovah's and grace, appreciating the purpose and plan God has with the nation Israel, and getting a grasp upon those things so that everything that follows after, that's constantly making reference to those issues, is something that you're alerted to, that you see, and then therefore there's comprehension to you as you deal with those matters. Well, that's why we're still here in Joshua right now, and we're still looking at some things before we really start the first course of punishment, though we will get into that now in this lesson. Well, let's get underway once again. Joshua chapter 23, we ended up last time with this passage, and we were seeing the fact that even though things went well in Joshua's day, and even though the conquest of the land started out well, and there was a cleaving to the Lord, an appreciation of His Jehovah's and grace, as a whole, that's what was going on, and the good things the Lord had promised them. As Joshua said, the Lord did not withhold from you. But Joshua also recognized that there were seeds of rebelliousness that had been sowed in the nation, and that they began to take root once they get into the land there. It's not that they didn't exist before. They certainly did. But they took good root in the land there, and they began to bring forth some fruit. Achan, for example, in chapter 7 was an example of that, but he wasn't the only one, but he was an example of it. And Joshua recognized that those seeds of rebelliousness were going to cause problems for the nation, and there was a need to confront them. And he confronts them here on the day before he dies. And he sets before Israel the issue of God's Jehovah-ness once again, and the fact that that's where the victories come from. That's where the conquest, that's how the conquest has been successful and everything. It's all been because of God's Jehovah-ness. And He's gone before them and done what He said He's done, and they've been experiencing the good because they've been cleaving unto Him in that sense. But if you remember once again last time, look here at chapter 23 one more time if you would, and look with me at verse 15. Therefore it shall come to pass that as all good things that come upon you, which the Lord your God promised you, so shall the Lord bring upon you all evil things, until He have destroyed you from off this good land, which the Lord your God hath given you. When ye have transgressed the covenant of the Lord your God, which He commanded you, and have gone and served other gods, and bowed yourselves to them, then shall the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and ye shall perish quickly from off the good land which He hath given unto you. They haven't experienced, once they've been in the land here now, the anger of the Lord, with the exception of that Achan incident. But the issue now, but because of that, the issue now is you're in jeopardy, Israel, of not cleaving to the Lord any longer. And instead of getting any goodness, you're going to get the curses. And as the Lord's been faithful to the goodness, He'll be faithful to that. And the reason why He's faithful to the goodness is because the contract called for it. And He's faithful to His word. You know, today we renegotiate contracts at a drop of a hat. Someone's name on a line means nothing today. And someone's a little bit upset a couple minutes after or a few months after they've signed the contract. They want to renegotiate, as if that's supposed to be normal operating procedure. But that's not the way it is with the Lord here at all. And He's been faithful to do the good if they perform, and He'll do the evil if they don't, just like the contract calls for. Now, what I want you to see in connection with this is not only the reality of the seeds of rebelliousness being sown there in Joshua's generation, and therefore the naturalness, I guess you might say, of them springing forth and bearing forth their fruit in the generation following Joshua, which very thing they do, and therefore that brings the first course of punishment upon them. But I want you to see one more thing here in connection with this. That's in chapter 24. Joshua does something with Israel in connection with this. He makes a covenant with them. Now, we've been seeing some covenants here. Well, the old diagram's gone here. We'll put them on the board in just a few minutes here as we proceed on. But the law contract itself is the central issue. We saw that Jehovah's contract God made with Israel there through Moses at the end, before Moses died. And now Joshua sees the seeds of rebelliousness, and he makes a covenant with this generation that's going to be in existence after he dies, not to let the seed of rebelliousness sprout forth and bring forth its ugly fruits. Look at it here, chapter 24. We won't go down through the entire chapter. It'd be great if we had the time to do all that, but I want you to see the reality of what's taking place here. In verse 1, at least, to get the setting. And Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem, and called for the elders of Israel, the governmental leaders, and for their heads, and for their judges, and for their officers. And they presented themselves before God. And then Joshua reviews once again the history of God's Jehovah-ness, and even forming this nation for himself, beginning there in verse 2 and running right down to what they've received out of his Jehovah's grace at the present time, the successful conquest of the land to the point at which it has been brought. In verse 13, for example, it says, "And I have given you a land for which ye did not labor, and cities which ye built not, and ye dwell in them. Of the vineyards and olive yards which ye planted not, do you eat." But there's no merit in you getting these things. They're not giving you as a reward. You got them because of God's Jehovah's grace once again. Now verse 14. "Now therefore fear the Lord, and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood, and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord." I'll stop and think here, folks. Joshua was telling them, put away your gods. There must be some gods there for them to put away. There must be something that Joshua's seeing going on amongst them. That seed of rebelliousness issue once again. He sees it as a real big issue. And he sees the temptations that are in their hearts and everything. He sees them now in the midst of Satan's hotbed for the implementation of his plan of evil on this earth, and for the course for this world he's charted, and for all the ungodliness and abomination, the things God hates and everything. They're in the midst of that land right now. And he knows that God brought Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, out of the midst of all that, and made a complete sanctification of Abraham unto himself from those things. He knows that they saw those things in Egypt, and God made a complete sanctification of them from those things when he brought them out of Egypt and closed the Red Sea behind them. But he sees that they brought those things with them. Though they've been cut off from those things, the temptation is to go back to those things. There's an attraction to the course of this world that Satan's charted. And he knows the policy of evil's desire. He was there with, if you go back to Deuteronomy 32 on your own there and everything with that song, he was there with that song being composed. And he knew what that thing set forth. When that song set forth what Israel would do in following the policy of evil. He was there at that. He was in privy council with Moses when God told him, I know what they'll do. They'll go whoring after other gods and follow the gods of those nations after you die. Well, Joshua's seen the seeds that were spoken about back there, and he sees the sprigs coming up, and they're starting to manifest themselves among the people. Well, if they start to get hold, what's the contract going to call for? Course 1. Put them away, therefore, he says. Verse 15, and if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, Jehovah. And the people answered and said, God forbid that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For the Lord our God is he that brought us up out of and our fathers out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, and which did those great sins in our sight, great signs in our sight, and preserved us in all the way wherein we went, and among all the people through whom we passed. And the Lord drave out from before us all the people, even the Amorites which dwelt in the land. Therefore will we also serve the Lord, for he is our God. And Joshua, that sounds great, doesn't it? Look at what Joshua says. And Joshua said unto the people, ye cannot serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions nor your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve strange gods, then he will turn and will do hurt and consume you after that ye hath done you good. And the people said unto Joshua, nay, but we will serve the Lord. And Joshua said unto the people, ye are witnesses against yourselves that ye have chosen you the Lord to serve him. And they said, we are witnesses. Now therefore put away, said he, the strange gods which are among you, and incline your heart unto the Lord God of Israel. And the people said unto Joshua, the Lord our God will we serve, and his voice will we obey. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, and he set them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and took a great stone and set it up there under an oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said unto all the people, behold, this stone shall be a witness unto us, for it hath heard all the words of the Lord which he spake unto us. It shall be therefore a witness unto you, lest ye deny your God. So Joshua let the people depart, every man unto his inheritance. Now there's more than we're going to have time to deal with, but I want you to notice they make this covenant once again that they're not going to let those seeds of rebelliousness that Joshua's mentioned there, they're not going to let those things bring forth fruit. And really what they're coming along and saying is that we'll squash those things. We'll rid ourselves of those things. And Joshua exhorts them to do it. He says therefore in verse 23, now therefore put away, said he, the strange gods which are among you. They're there. He knows they're there. Put away, he says. And incline your heart unto the Lord God of Israel. It's that last expression, verse 23, I'm concerned with right now. Incline your heart unto the Lord God of Israel. When Joshua says that, he realizes that the situation in Israel is that their hearts have been inclining away. It's kind of like when you put something on an incline, you tilt it and everything. It's at an angle. And it's kind of like if I were to stand like this, for example, and I were to lean back like this, I'm inclining myself away. And if I incline myself towards, I go this way. And what Joshua recognizes, their hearts have been inclining themselves away from the Lord. There's the Lord there. And their hearts have been inclining themselves away. And they've been moving towards the policy of evil. And they got the strange gods among them. He says, put them away and incline your heart towards the Lord. He knows what's going on. And if they don't do this, they make a covenant to do it. But if they don't do it, then the first course of punishment is going to come. Now here they are, making another covenant to do something. But they can't do it. And the first course comes. Now we begin the history. Not that Joshua wasn't history, I don't mean to imply that. But now we begin the history in connection with Leviticus 26. Now we're going to see the beginning of the courses of punishment coming upon the nation. And the first course to come, once again, is Leviticus 26, verses 16 and 17. You need to now, for the time being, at least take a slip of paper or your finger, whatever you want, and get it back in Leviticus 26. Because what we're going to be doing now is we're going to be looking at the reality of what's said here beginning to come upon the nation. I got a piece of paper right here that I'm just going to, well, I think I'll be all right for a bit here. Prepare anyway to keep on going back to Leviticus 26. But come with me now, if you would, to the book of Judges. When you start reading the book of Judges, the first verse says, now after the death of Joshua it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites first to fight against them? They're all set to continue the conquest of the land, just like they're supposed to. There was much more land to be conquered, as it said back there in chapter 18 and following of Joshua. And it was going to be the generation following Joshua that would do that. And things look good here, man. They just made that covenant that they'll put those seeds of rebellion out of the way and they'll cleave for the Lord. Their inclining heart that's going this way away will come back. And things start like they're looking pretty good here. They want to know who's going up against the Canaanites first. They want the Lord to tell them that. Man, he's directing the battle, isn't he? Man, things are going great here so far, at least appearance-wise. And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have delivered the land into his hand. And you start going down here and everything, and things seem to be going all right. There are some things that don't seem to be right on track, so to speak. But the general layout of things seems to be pretty good. Until you get down a few verses into chapter 1 here. Come on down, if you would, here in chapter 1 to verse 22. Well, in verse 19. It says, And the Lord was with Judah, and he drave out the inhabitants of the mountain, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron. Well, that's a strange thing. The Lord was with Judah, and he drave out the inhabitants of the mountain, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron. Inhabitants of the mountain get driven out, but couldn't drive out the inhabitants of the valley. Now, is it because the Lord couldn't do that? Couldn't handle that? Well, no. The Lord can part the Red Sea. The Lord can bring all those plagues upon Egypt. The Lord's sovereign God, he can do it. No problem with that. But you got to remember once again that they're operating with the Lord in connection with the law contract. And there's something now going on that's inhibiting the Lord's capacity with them. They can't drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they have chariots of iron. There's something about those chariots of iron that changed the attitude of the children of Judah. Now, I just want you to note that right now. As you're reading on down through the book of Judges here, like I said, everything seems to be going right, and then all of a sudden you hit a phrase that sounds like grinding metal in a fine machinery. And something horrible has gone wrong. And now that just develops and amplifies. And you hear that sound repeatedly. And you're going to keep on coming across an expression now in which it talks about the other tribes not driving out the inhabitants that they're supposed to. And they do things in violation of that law contract. They start making covenants with the inhabitants. And they start making peace treaties with them. And they start making them tributes to them. All things that are violations of the express command to utterly destroy them. And this now, those seeds of rebelliousness, now start bearing the fruits of rebelliousness and a contrary walk towards God and a transgression of that law contract. Continue on here. Pick up verse 22. And the house of Joseph, they also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph sent to descry Bethel. Now the name of the city before was Luz. And the spies saw a man come forth out of the city. And they said unto him, Show us, we pray thee, the entrance into the city, and we will show thee mercy. If you would have gone back, and we didn't take the time to do it, but if you would have gone back and look at the passages, sitting back there in the book of Exodus, and sitting back there in the book of Numbers in particular, and in the book of Deuteronomy, concerning how you deal with the inhabitants of the land, you'd realize this isn't right. This isn't what they're supposed to be doing here. And when he showed them the entrance of the city, they smote the city with the edge of the sword, but they let go the man and all his family. And the man went into the land of the Hittites and built a city and called the name thereof Luz, which is the name thereof unto this day. Neither did Manasseh drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and her towns, nor Tanakh and her towns, nor the inhabitants of Dor and her towns, nor the inhabitants of Ibleam and her towns, nor the inhabitants of Megiddo and her towns, but the Canaanites would dwell in that land. That's direct violation of what she's supposed to do. She wouldn't drive them out. And it came to pass when Israel was strong that they put the Canaanites to tribute, and did not utterly drive them out. Neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites which dwelt in Gezer, but the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. Neither did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, nor the inhabitants of Nahal, but the Canaanites dwelt among them and became tributaries. Neither did Asher drive the inhabitants, but the Asherites, verse 32, dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Neither did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants, as it says there are the places described in verse 33, but they became tributaries to them. And the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the for they would not suffer them to come down to the valley. But the Amorites would dwell in Mount Heres, in Aijalon, and in Shalbim. Yet the hand of the house of Joseph prevailed, so they became tributaries. That's all disobedience there, folks. That's not the way things are supposed to go. Those seeds of rebelliousness, once again now, are bearing the fruit of rebelliousness. And now they're going to be confronted with that. Chapter 2, verse 1. And the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochum, and said, I made you to go up out of Egypt, and have brought you unto the land which I swear unto your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And ye shall make no league with the inhabitants of this land. Ye shall throw down their altars, but ye have not obeyed my voice. Why have ye done this? Wherefore I said unto you, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be as thorns in your sides, and their God shall be a snare unto you. That's the policy of evil there. And it shall come to pass, when the angel of the Lord spake these words unto all the children of Israel, that the people lifted up their voice and wept. And they called the name of that place Bochum, and they sacrificed there unto the Lord. The angel of the Lord comes along, confronts them with their disobedience. And the whole reason by which, the whole method by which the Lord would drive them out is by them doing what they were supposed to do. That's the principles of which the law of contract operates once again. I told you don't make any league with them. Throw down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Once again, in Leviticus 26, beginning in verse 14, when he begins to describe the situation that will be coming upon the nation if they don't perform that law contract, the issue is, if you don't obey my voice and hearken unto my commandments and do my statutes in deed and so forth, they aren't obeying his voice here. So now they're in a position where they are worthy of getting the things spoken about in Leviticus 26, commencing with course 1. And the angel of the Lord confronts them with that. And there's a repentance there that appears to be good. But it's a very short-lived thing and a very superficial thing. And the rest of the chapter now goes on in chapter 2 and describes that what you've just been presented with, the historical situation that commenced following Joshua's death that you've just gone over, is the background for worthiness for the first course of punishment to come. And the second chapter will now go on to describe God brought it upon them. And the rest of the book of Joshua will give you a history, pardon me, the book of Judges. The rest of the book of Judges will give you a history of the nation of Israel under the first course of punishment. Chapter 2 of Judges, verse 6. And when Joshua had let the people go, now you're getting back once again to chapter 1 there in Judges. You're going back and you're reviewing the situation, and now you're going to get a condensed version of Israel's rebelliousness. When Joshua had let the people go, the children of Israel went every man unto his inheritance to possess the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord that he did for Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him in the border of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the mount of Ephraim, on the north side of the hill Gaash. And also all that generation were gathered unto their fathers, the generation that had seen the things that the Lord did. And there arose another generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. Now that's what you just got described for you in chapter 1, in the beginning of chapter 2 here in Judges. You just got that generation described for you. And you just saw the result of them not knowing the Lord and not having acquaintance with the works which he had done for Israel. And they're ignoring of those things. And what's the fruit of it? Verse 11. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and served Baalim. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, which brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods, of the gods of the people that were round about them. The very thing Joshua knew they were going to do, the very thing he knew was in their possession. That covenant that they made with Joshua there really wasn't worth the rock that represented it. And they bowed themselves unto them and provoked the Lord to anger. And that's an expression, folks, that as you go through Israel's history, you got to note it every time you see it. Because every time you see that expression, you're seeing something about one of the courses of curses. Every expression of the course of curses is an expression of the Lord's displeasure with them. And they provoke him to anger, and he brings the course upon them, or a feature of the course upon them. They provoked the Lord to anger, and verse 13 says, and they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. Now, that puts them in a position of being worthy of receiving the first course of punishment. And they get it, verse 14. In fact, verses 14 and 15 describe the first course of punishment coming upon the nation. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he delivered them into the hands of spoilers that spoiled them. And he sold them into the hands of their enemies round about, so that they could not any longer stand before their enemies. Whithersoever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn unto them, and they were greatly distressed. Now, before we look at the details of what it says there regarding what the Lord did, which we'll see match up with the issues back there in the first course of punishment, I want you to notice that verse 15 says that what the Lord did when his hand was against them for evil, he just didn't do because all of a sudden he thought of it at that moment and said, I think I'll do this. Nor was it something that came out of the blue, so to speak, to Israel, and they couldn't figure out why in the world the Lord was doing this to them. No, look what it says once again in verse 15. Whithersoever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn unto them. The Lord had told them what the consequences were going to be if they, on the basis of that law contract, and in connection with the terms of that law contract, failed to perform. If they rebelled against him and walked contrary to him, he told them what they were going to get. They were aware of it, therefore. It was even written down in words they could read. And the priests, once again, had the job of making sure that knowledge was there to the people. There was not only that one occasion, once again, when they were to come and have the words of the law rehearsed to them on a regular basis, but they were entrusted individually with the responsibility to be speaking these things amongst themselves, teaching their children these things all the time, talking about them in the field when they sit down for meals and things along this line. They had what the Lord had said, and they knew it. But the other thing that's stressed there in verse 15 is also as the Lord had sworn unto them. And that focuses once again upon the covenant itself. Not that the other didn't, but it focuses upon the contracted aspect of this. That this is what they signed on the dotted line to be the receivers of when their conduct merited it by rebelling against the Lord. That expression there, the swearing concept, once again, focus right upon what took place there when that law, that sworn oath covenant was made with them. All the Lord has said, we will do. Man, they swore to fulfill it. Well, what you're being told here once again now is what they're receiving is the first course of those contracted curses. Now look at it once again, verse 14. The anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he delivered them into the hands of spoilers that spoiled them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies round about, so they could not any longer stand before their enemies. You got that sort of paper, or your finger's still sitting back to Leviticus 26? Let's come back here now, Leviticus 26, and let's look at that first course of punishment again. Now this is simply a description of what takes place here, It's not a total description of everything that goes on, nor a graphic description of the mechanics by which this thing took place. You see all that as you go through the rest of the book of Joshua, and see the historical outcome and working out of these things here. But there's enough sitting in verse 14 there to clearly match up with what's sitting back there as part of what's going to be going on in that first course of punishment. Leviticus 26 once again, and look with me if you would at verse 16. Verse 14 and 15 is the statement, if you won't hearken, if you despise, if you won't hear my voice and so forth, and you won't do my judgments and my commands, you break my covenant, I, verse 16, also will do this unto you. I will even appoint over you the terror, consumption, and the burning ague that shall consume the eyes and cause sorrow of heart. I didn't really see that there in Judges. We'll get to that. And ye shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. And I'll set my face against you, and ye shall be slain before your enemies. They that hate you shall reign, and ye shall flee when none pursueth you. Now we went over in the previous lessons the general gist of what's involved in each one of these courses of punishment. We noted here in this first course they primarily got two aspects to it. One that personally affected them as individuals in connection with physical illnesses, physical afflictions, and so forth there. Their personal well-being and comfort and everything is distressed. And the second aspect has to do with their national well-being and their capacity once again to be well and restful within the land. And instead of once again of having their enemies being at peace in their land and having their enemies being chased by them, the opposite takes place. And rather what takes place is that they sow their seed in vain, their enemies shall eat it. The Lord sets his face against them, and instead of being for them, his face is against them, and they're slain before their enemies. They may try and go out there and take some of that land on their own, but they're going to end up being slain before their enemies. The Lord's going to set his face against them, not for them. And they that hate them shall reign over them in that tributary manner. They'll make Israel pay customs and taxes and all this kind of business. Make them pay tribute to be left alone and to not be pummeled all the time by them. And you shall flee, he says, when none pursueth you. I don't think you have any trouble realizing that when you get over here, Judges chapter 2 and verses 14 and 15, that the enemy aspect, the national well-being aspect, the distress of their well-being spoken about in Leviticus 26 in that first course of punishment is the issue the Lord brings upon them here. Look at the way in which it's described once again there in verse 14. He delivers them, it says, into the hands of spoilers that spoiled them. Well, if they're spoiled by their enemies, what their enemies do is they come in and they take things that they've got. They take things that Israel's got for their own spoil. They get the spoils of war, so to speak. They make raids upon them, and they come and say, they take things that they've got, and they spoil them, and they impoverish them, and they leave them without the capacity to have things that they've worked to have. One of the obvious and one of the easy things to understand, and one of the things that comes out when you go through Judges there, you see a perfect example of it with Gideon, for example. He's threshing wheat in the hollowed out section of the wine press to hide what he's doing from the Midianites. Because they come in, if they saw him doing that, and they saw that grain there and some of that harvest that they were able to bring in, they'd come in with a raiding party and take it, spoil them. But see, that's the issue back there in Leviticus 26. We saw that. Verse 16, once again, you'll sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. They sow their seed all right, but their enemies come in. They sow it in vain. Their enemies eat it. Their enemies come in and raid and take it. They spoil them. The very thing Judges 2 and verse 14 saying. The Lord delivers them to the hand of spoilers, and they spoil them. And you see that throughout the book of Judges there. I just gave you the example of Gideon. All we're going to do, by the way, folks, as we go through this first course of punishment, I'm going to focus upon the reality of it coming upon the nation. I'm going to give you the book, chapter, and verse parameters of the first course of punishment, just a few minutes here. I'm going to quickly survey for you the book of Judges and the book of Ruth in the first part of the book of Samuel, which is what the first course of punishment covers. And I'm going to have to trust you and leave it up to you to do the reading of it through. And to see the reality of what you're seeing here in chapter 2. To see the incidents of spoiling. And to see the mechanics of how it was done. To read about a Midianite raid, for example. I just gave you the example of Gideon there. And the reason why that takes place is because of what it says here. Because that's an aspect of the first course of punishment. They were experiencing it in Gideon's day. And he was afraid of the raid that would take place, the border raid that would take place. And that's only one example. There's others all throughout. There's 13 judges that are raised up. Next phrase there in verse 14 says, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies round about, so they could not any longer stand before their enemies. And he sold them into the hands of their enemies. If you come back to Leviticus 26 once again, look at verse 17. He says, I will set my face against you, and ye shall be slain before your enemies. They that hate you shall reign over you, and ye shall flee when none pursueth you. Well, he sells them into the hands of their enemies. If he sells them into the hands of their enemies, it's like the enemies have got control over them, therefore. It's like the enemies have bought them, and the Lord sells them into the hands that they're yours. You control them now. And that's the issue, once again, of them that hating you, reigning over you. That's that tributary reign. And that's that measure of control that the first course said would come upon the nation. The enemy would have a measure of control over them. And there'd be a fear that would be instilled in the hearts of the Israelites under that condition. And they'll flee when none pursueth them. There'd be an understanding, once again, of the Lord's face being against them, and him no longer going out there and fighting for them and defeating their enemies for them. And that's exactly what's being described now over here in Judges chapter 2. And the verse 14 once again says, he sold them into the hands of their enemies round about, so that they could not any longer stand before their enemies. And whithersoever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil. And they were greatly distressed. Couldn't stand before their enemies any longer. They might try and resist and everything, but they couldn't stand. If you can't stand before, what do? You flee, don't you? You run. He says you're going to flee when none pursueth you. The enemies are just going to come along. Israel will come along and rattle a few swords and everything like that. And the enemy will come along and rattle back, and Israel will just tremble and flee. The enemy won't even bother pursuing them. They'll just keep on putting the tributary taxes on them, paining them that way and greatly distressing them that way. That's the first course of punishment, folks. And you're being told here in Judges chapter 2 that with the generation following Joshua, the first course of punishment came upon the nation. Now, let me give you the book, chapter, and verse parameters of the first course of punishment. All right, we got our chart on the board here once again. Law contract, Mount Sinai, crossing the Jordan River into the land. Things go pretty good there. Let's just let J.O. there stand for Joshua. Things go pretty good in the days of Joshua. But it's the generation following Joshua that the first course of punishment gets itself underway. And you see the reality of the statement of it there in Judges chapter 2. And the first course of punishment begins to come upon the nation, the generation following Joshua, and the parameters for the scope of the first course of punishment. I'll put the number 1 up there for its beginning and run a line out here. And the parameters for the scope of the first course of punishment is this. It's Judges chapter 1, verse 1, all the way through to 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 35. That's what you got. Judges 1:1 to 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 35. That's the scope, historical scope of the first course of punishment by itself. Keep in mind once again that when the second course comes, the things in the first course still remain in effect. The second course and its 7 times more punishments intensify the curses by adding another layer of curses on top. But as far as the first course standing by itself until the second course arrives, or is ready to arrive, I really need to clarify and say it that way, and you'll see why when we get to it. The scope of the first course standing by itself until the second course is ready to arrive is what you got from Judges 1:1 to 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 35. That 35th verse, that's a tongue twister, of 1 Samuel 15 is the last verse of 1 Samuel 15. Now, I'll hold off on saying what I was going to say there. I'll wait till we get to the end of the historical account there. And I said a few minutes ago that it brings up to the point where the readiness for the second course is there. And Samuel will demonstrate to Israel the readiness for the second course. He'll kind of give them a foretaste of it, that the nation's worthy of it. Truth of the matter, as we'll see when we get there, God does something unexpected and uncontracted for. When the second course is ready to come upon the nation, he doesn't bring it right away. In fact, he actually gives Israel an interlude of glorious blessing under David and under Solomon. And he does that for a very particular reason, which we'll have one lesson just dedicated to that. And we'll see it when we get to it. But that's why I said, and we'll say more about it when we get there, that's why I said the parameters for the first course are Judges 1:1 to 1 Samuel 15:35, and that brings you up to the point when you're ready for the second course to get underway. The second course actually does not begin until what's recorded in 1 Kings chapter 11, after Solomon's death. But we'll see all that and everything. But right now we're just concerned with the first course of punishment. Now, those two verses here in Judges chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, you'll find the things spoken about there throughout that portion of God's Word. And the amount of time that takes, the historical time span, duration of time that's in view, is about 450 years, spanning right through what's recorded in the book of Judges, the book of Ruth, and those first 15 chapters of 1 Samuel. Samuel, the book of Judges is called Judges because there's a series of judges that God raises up for Israel during that first course of punishment. In fact, we'll begin reading about that in just a moment in verse 16. It'll say, "Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges." Throughout the scope of the first course of punishment, throughout the book of Judges, the book of Ruth, and the first 15 chapters of 1 Samuel, God raises up a series of judges. And what he does through those judges is judge Israel's rebelliousness and manifest through them the reality of the first course of punishment coming upon the nation. And he provides, if they respond to the judge, deliverance from the affliction of that first course of punishment. But and through a span of 450 years, that process is in effect. But what you see as you go through the account is that though there is, and it'll be acknowledged here before you even start reading the account, it'll give you what you're supposed to see as you go through the account before it even starts going through it, is that God raises up the judge, and for a while under the judge, the nation responds. But then when the judge dies, the nation goes back and gets back in rebelliousness again, but gets back in rebelliousness a little worse than they were. And then another judge is raised up, and when he or she dies, another return to rebelliousness takes place, and it's a little worse than the other one. And there's a downward spiraling process that Israel goes through. And it's because and the worst of it is confronted in Samuel's day. In fact, we'll spend a little bit of time in the beginning of 1 Samuel there to notice the worthiness of the nation being ready for the second course of punishment. And what you'll see over there in the first few chapters of 1 Samuel, you'll see two horrendous acts on Israel's part. One was to have allowed the tabernacle of the Lord in Shiloh to be in the hands of Satan's own men. Eli's two sons were children of Belial, and they were the priests of the Lord, and they ran the tabernacle, Satan's own men ran the tabernacle. That's how bad things had gotten in Israel. And the second thing you're confronted with in 1 Samuel is the rejection of the theocracy. When they want a king to be made like other nations, they actually ask for Samuel to do the very thing that the policy of evil against him, Satan's policy of evil against him, is so zealous to produce. Satan's capacity to corrupt Israel lay in the issue of corrupting the distinctiveness from the rest of the nations and their separation from the rest of the nations. And yet their rebelliousness had gone to such a degree at the end of almost at the end of 450 years being under that first course of punishment, and their failure to hearken and be reformed by these things, that they actually asked to have the policy of evil have its way rather than God. That's phenomenal. But that's what it is. That's what took place. And it's in connection with those two things, the tabernacle already being in Satan's own hands, and now wanting to turn the government over to him, that they put themselves in the position of being worthy to receive that second course of punishment. And that's what you see in 1 Samuel in the first 15 chapters. You're confronted with that. But before you ever even look at those things, you need to appreciate the fact that chapter 2 here in Judges is telling you what you're going to see throughout the rest of the book of Judges, throughout the book of Ruth, and throughout those first 15 chapters of Samuel. Look here now, if you would, beginning in verse 16 of Judges 2. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges, which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them, and yet they would not hearken unto their judges, but they went a-whoring after other gods, and bowed themselves unto them. They turned quickly out of the way which their fathers walked in, obeying the commandments of the Lord, but they did not so. And when the Lord raised them up judges, then the Lord was with the judge, and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For it repented the Lord because of their groanings, by reason of them that oppressed them and vexed them. And it came to pass, when the judge was dead, that they returned and corrupted themselves more than their fathers, in following other gods, to serve them and to bow down to them. They ceased not from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. And he said, because that this people hath transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and they have not hearkened unto my voice, I also will not henceforth drive out any from before them of the nations which Joshua left when he died. And he goes on and says some other things we'll take notice of a little later if time permits. But what I'm asking you to get appreciate, you're being told here in chapter 2, the latter part of chapter 2 is coming along, and it's telling you how to deal with the book of Judges. And what follows in Ruth and the opening of the book of Samuel. The first thing it's telling you is to realize that in the generation that followed Joshua, being described here now in the book of Judges, the first course of punishment came upon the nation Israel. You're being told that from verse 1 and down through to verse 15. And then you're being told that throughout this first course of punishment, God raised up judges, and he did what the first course was designed to do, get them to hearken unto him, be reformed by him, and he confronted them with their rebelliousness, and he manifested to them that they get the curses that they merit because their rebellious conduct and their contrary walk and everything. And he describes how what you're going to read now in the book of Judges is that for a period of time, while that judge was in effect, the people did respond to it. But then when that judge died, the people went right back and did worse than their fathers. And what you're being told, therefore, in advance is when you go through the book of Judges and you go down through these 13 judges here and you end up with Samuel there, the opening chapter of 1 Samuel, you're being told that what you're seeing is a downward progression in Israel's part. It's kind of like a staircase in which they go down and down and down, and they put themselves in a position of being worthy for receiving that second course of punishment. They start up and God raises up a judge and everything. The judge dies and they plummet themselves down again. Raise up another judge and they're okay while the judge is there, and then the judge dies and they go down. Raise up another judge and they're okay while the judge is there, and then the judge dies and they go down. And they get worse and worse and worse. Note that expression very carefully there in verse 21. And it came to pass when the judge was dead that they returned and corrupted themselves more than their fathers in following other gods to serve them and to bow down unto them. They ceased not from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. All you have throughout the book of Judges is temporary halts stays to the first course of punishment and its curses, but you don't have a return in which the first course ever gets itself reversed. All you get is temporary halt and stays with the judge, and then they corrupt themselves more than their fathers, and they don't cease from their stubborn way, and you go right down to the point of worthiness for the second course. And you're being told here in advance before you ever start reading the historical account in Judges and go through those 13 plus judges that that's what you're going to be reading about. And you anticipate, therefore, coming to a point when worthiness for the second course of punishment is going to be written for you in the text. Now, I'm giving you that information in advance because we haven't got time to go through it and see it all. I'm telling you where you get that written issue regarding worthiness for the second course is in the end of, and it is in 1 Samuel, and especially in chapters 12 through 15. All of 1 Samuel deals with it, the first 15 chapters, but especially in chapters 12 through 15, do you end up in view of the tabernacle being in Satan's hands and their desire to have a king like the other nations. That's the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, as far as God's concerned. When they did that, his anger waxed hot to the point of saying to Samuel, tell them the second course is coming. They're ready for it. And Samuel performs a sign regarding the second course. And they're ready to receive it. Now, Judges 2 has set you up for that already. And you understand that because you understand Leviticus 26. Because you understand those courses of punishment, then you know what's happening here. And you see it, and you know that based on what it says here, since they don't cease from their stubborn ways, that the second course is what they're going to merit, and you're going to be, and with the knowledge of the second course in your head, you're reading along. And when you keep on coming across first course of punishment things, you keep on saying the first course is still in effect, first course is still in effect. You'll find that throughout the whole book of Judges. You'll find that throughout the book of Ruth. You'll find it in the first opening chapter, 1 Samuel there, but you'll see some horrendous things taking place there. And as you read those things, you'll come along and say, man, when's the second course coming? How long-suffering can God be? And that's really what the first 15 chapters of 1 Samuel will confront you with. And then you see the break. Then you see the straw that breaks the camel's back, and God says a second course is coming. Now, we're going to deal with 1 Samuel in the opening chapters there in connection with getting ready for the second course. But I want you to see the issue here and to appreciate that issue here. I'm looking at my clock here now, and we're down to just a few minutes left, and I'm just thinking of the best thing that needs to be done here. I want you to note one more time the issue of God raising up judges. Verse 16. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges, which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. We really ought to take the time to say some things about this, folks. There isn't enough time in the remainder of this lesson to deal with it adequately, and I'll determine between now and the next lesson whether we'll take the time to say some things beyond what I'm going to say right now. But it's important that you acknowledge something critical that's going on here. I want you to think about verse 16 there for a second. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges, which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. When you go back to Leviticus 26 or any place in the law of contract, you can't find it contracted any place that God would do that. What you need to understand is that God's dealing with Israel here on the basis of his mercy and the basis of his grace and his compassion. And he's doing something that the law of contract didn't contract for. Now, there's an extremely important passage sitting back in the book of Exodus when the law contract first came down and it was first gone over, that God taught Moses about the fact that he had the right, reserved himself the right to operate outside that law contract. And he did that because if he didn't reserve himself that right, he would have to wipe Israel out. That's how bad they were going to be. but he reserved the right to operate on the basis of mercy and compassion outside that law contract. Now he does that throughout every course. And you see the first example of it right here in the first course. He doesn't have to raise up judges. There's nothing in Leviticus 26 says he has to do that. But he does it. He does it out of his mercy. He has compassion on them. And we're going to see an example of that in every course. In fact, the whole issue regarding David and Solomon is done outside the law contract. Now, I think it's important for us to say some more about that, but time is not going to permit it in this lesson. So I am going to, I believe, take some time at the beginning of the next lesson and say a little bit more about that. Have you look at the issue back there in Exodus, where that statement is made. And have you appreciate, as Israel should have appreciated, the fact that God reserved himself that right. And thank the Lord he did. Otherwise he would have had to wipe them out. But you're seeing an example of that here. Now, every one of those judges that gets raised up, Gideon, Samson, Deborah, Barak, and so forth there. Every one of those judges that gets raised up, God raised them up because he's being merciful to his people. And out of mercy, he wants them to respond to that first course of punishment and not have the second one have to come upon them. But that's where we are right now. First course of punishment is getting itself underway. You got the parameters for it. Judges chapter 1, verse 1 through 1 Samuel 15:35. Next time we'll say some more about the issue of God's mercy. We'll take a quick survey of the first course of punishment, and we'll see the setup for the second course in the opening chapters of 1 Samuel.